Sir, unless your dog can read Braille or lead you across traffic, it's still just a pet. And pets come with a fee, the clerk said with a smirk, tapping the $180 charge into the system. He stood there in silence, holding papers no one cared to read, while the clerk added the fee anyway. His hand tightened around the folder, not in anger, in decision. Then the phone rang, and in the next 7 minutes, that smirk vanished. A voice on the line shut down the hotel and changed company policy forever. You'll want to see what happened next because this wasn't just about one veteran. It was about all of them. Snow had just begun to fall in soft, quiet flurries as Frank Delaney pulled into the gravel parking lot of the historic Red Elk Lodge in Missoula, Montana. The cold bit through the night air like it had purpose, settling deep into the bones of anyone who dared linger too long outside. Frank didn't mind the chill, not after the deserts of Kandahar and the jungles of Panama. In truth, he preferred it. The cold had a way of silencing the world. The lodge was a relic of another era. Hand-carved beams framed the entrance and yellowed photographs of frontier soldiers hung behind frosted lobby windows. Inside, a single desk lamp glowed behind the reception counter. Frank stepped in shadow by his side, a sleek black Labrador moving in perfect step, with him alert, calm, and loyal. Frank Delaney was 68, his back curved slightly from old jumps and years of load-bearing missions. His silver hair peeked from beneath a navy ball cap. Beneath his jacket, a worn flannel clung to his frame, and in his hand he held a soft leather folder, its edges curled from time and use. Inside were papers he'd learned to carry everywhere: service records, Shadow's registration, VA medical documentation, proof of things he shouldn't have to prove anymore. At the desk sat a young man no more than 24, tapping aimlessly at the keyboard. His name tag read, Ryan. His smile was automatic, the kind you gave to pass the time. Evening, sir. Checking in, Ryan asked without looking up. Yes. Delaney, Frank Delaney. Frank replied, steady but not unfriendly. Shadow sat patiently beside him, posture straight, eyes scanning the quiet lobby, just as he'd been trained. Ryan typed a few keys and retrieved a single room key from the drawer behind him. Room 1061, Queen. Staying one night, Frank nodded. I'm in town for a funeral. Marine. Old friend. Ryan gave a neutral grunt and pushed a clipboard forward. Sorry to hear that. Standard policy form. Sign there and we'll get you set. Frank reached for the pen, but Ryan paused, his eyes suddenly fixed on Shadow. Pets aren't allowed in rooms, he said, the smile fading into a frown. You'll need to pay a cleaning fee. Frank glanced down at Shadow, who sat motionless, wearing his clearly marked vest that read, Service Animal, Do Not Pet. He's not a pet, Frank said calmly. He's a medical service dog, fully trained, covered by the ADA. Ryan looked skeptical. Sure, but the owner's real picky about animal dander in the rooms. It's an old building, you know. The carpets hold smells. We charge all guests with dogs. Frank gently slid the folder forward. Everything's here. Documentation, registration, medical necessity. Federal law doesn't allow you to charge for a service dog. Ryan barely looked. Yeah, we get all kinds with papers like this. I'm just doing my job. The warmth in his voice had vanished. He tapped the keyboard again, and a $150 pet sanitation fee appeared on the screen. Frank stared at the charge without blinking. Shadow leaned closer, sensing the shift. He wasn't growling, he didn't need to. His presence alone was steadying. The quiet check-in had turned. Frank wasn't angry. He was used to this by now. But he was tired. Tired of needing to explain why the scars on his mind required a dog's company more than most needed blood pressure meds. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, something colder had just begun to settle. Ryan's fingers tapped confidently on the keyboard, each click landing with a hollow finality. With a smug smile, he turned the monitor slightly so Frank could see the screen. Additional fee, $180. Animal sanitation, non-refundable. Frank took a breath through his nose. Not a sigh. Not quite. Just enough air to steady himself. He opened the leather folder with deliberate care, the way he'd once opened classified mission packets. Inside were neatly stacked documents, papers that had traveled with him to airports, courtrooms, and now this lodge in Missoula. He slid them across the counter with the quiet authority of a man who had fought bigger battles than this one. Here's my VA medical authorization, Frank said. That letter outlines my diagnosis. Here's the official ID for Shadow. And here's the federal code that protects service animals from extra charges under 80 law. Ryan barely glanced at the top sheet, then leaned back, folding his arms. Yeah, he said with a dismissive shrug. I've seen this kind of stuff before. Anyone can print it off the internet. Frank's jaw tightened. Are you saying this is fake? I'm saying I don't know what's real anymore. I had a lady last week with a chihuahua and a baby stroller tell me it was her emotional support animal. Showed me paperwork too. That wasn't a service dog, Frank replied, voice low. This is. Trained by Veterans for Recovery, over 18 months of certification. He performs specific tasks: nightmare interruption, panic intervention, mobility assistance. He's not a pet. Shadow remained motionless, but his dark eyes stayed trained on Ryan. The lobby had grown quiet. A couple, likely in their 70s, stood near the vending machine, silent and watching. The woman clutched a small coffee cup between both hands, her brow furrowed. Her husband stood slightly behind her, wearing a veteran ball cap of his own, though the insignia was too faded to make out from Frank's angle. To the right of the counter, a younger man, maybe late teens or early 20s, stood half hidden behind a pillar. A name tag peeked out from beneath his flannel jacket. Toby, intern. He didn't speak, but he was clearly listening. Ryan glanced over at the small audience forming around them and shifted uncomfortably. Look, sir, I'm not trying to be difficult, all right. I'm just following what my manager told me. Animals require sanitation fees. I didn't make the rules. No, but you're enforcing them incorrectly, Frank replied. You don't get to override federal law with hotel policy. Ryan scoffed under his breath. Well, you don't look disabled to me. The sentence landed like a slap. Frank didn't blink. He didn't flinch. But Shadow subtly moved closer, his side pressing gently against Frank's knee, grounding him. A small motion, but purposeful. Shadow had learned to recognize when Frank's breathing changed, when the tremor started in his left hand, when pressure in his chest began to tighten like a vice. Do you know what PTSD looks like? Frank asked, voice now a steady whisper. It doesn't always come with a cane or a wheelchair. Ryan averted his eyes but didn't apologize. I'm not a lawyer, he muttered. It's just easier to charge everyone the same. No, Frank said. It's easier to discriminate and hope people stay quiet. The couple at the vending machine didn't speak, but the woman slowly nodded. Ryan looked again at the screen. The 180 fee stared back like a dare. Frank didn't need a confrontation. He needed someone to understand. But it was becoming clear that understanding wasn't going to happen tonight, not behind that desk. Not yet. Frank stared at the screen as the 180 charge remained fixed in digital ink, unyielding, sterile final. But what began as frustration started to twist into something darker, heavier. It wasn't just the fee. It was the tone, the dismissiveness. The way Ryan had looked at Shadow like he was just a mutt on a leash instead of a lifeline that had kept Frank alive through nights most people wouldn't survive in dreams. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, a high, steady hum, nothing loud, nothing noticeable to most. But for Frank, it was enough. That sound, combined with the stale air, the synthetic scent of carpet shampoo, and the polished silence of the lobby, began to press down like weighted sandbags across his shoulders. The walls didn't move, but they felt closer, narrower. The ceiling didn't dip, but somehow the air above him felt thicker, denser. It always started the same way. Beirut, the smell of concrete dust and diesel fuel. The choking black smoke when the barracks went down in '83. Blood soaked into stone steps. Men younger than Ryan pulling each other from rubble, screaming for corpsmen that would never come. Then Iraq. The heat wasn't here, but Frank could still feel it dry, unrelenting, the way it stripped the back of your throat until you forgot what cool air felt like. He'd driven through Fallujah, past markets that looked harmless until they weren't. He'd seen kids with wired vests, boys younger than his grandson, used as pawns for explosives. The wrong glance, the wrong step. That's all it took. In Panama, the night missions, rain slicking the jungle leaves, mud that swallowed your boots and made everything slow and dangerous. The smell of rot and fear. Friends lost in silence, their bodies too far out to recover before the birds arrived. He still dreamed of that one mission in '89. He couldn't remember the code name, but he remembered the scream of his radio when contact went dead. Frank blinked hard, but the hotel lobby had already begun to dissolve. The marble desk, the laminated key cards, Ryan's smirk all blurred by the heat rising in his chest and the ringing in his ears. That's when Shadow moved. The dog didn't bark, didn't whine. He just shifted. First his paw, then his whole body easing closer so his hip brushed against Frank's leg. The touch was intentional, firm, calming. Shadow had been trained to sense it before Frank even recognized the symptoms himself. Shallow breath, elevated pulse, jaw clench, eye movement scanning exits and shadows. All signals, all familiar. Shadow's weight against his knee was like a hand pulling him from the edge. Not backward, just enough to stop the fall. Frank's hand, which had started to tremble, steadied. He exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate, the way the VA counselor had taught him years ago. In through 4, hold for 4, out for 6. He wasn't in Beirut, not now, not anymore. The hum of the lights faded, replaced by the sound of a young man's keyboard tapping again. Ryan. Frank looked at him. Really looked at him. Young, arrogant, but not cruel, just ignorant. Maybe this was his first job. Maybe he'd never even met a real veteran before. Maybe Frank reminded him of nothing except inconvenience. Still, the fire was there in Frank's chest. Not the fire of rage, but of weariness. Of every time he'd had to justify the things no one else could see. The broken sleep, the anxiety in crowds, the nights spent with a knife under the pillow long after the war was over. He had fought for the freedom to live a peaceful life, but peace had been the hardest battle of all. Frank reached down slowly and ran a hand across Shadow's back. "I'm still here," he whispered, not to anyone else, just to himself, and for now that had to be enough. Frank stood tall shoulders, squared his voice steady, despite the pressure building inside. "I understand you may not be familiar with the law," he said calmly, sliding the folder a few inches closer to Ryan, "but service animals trained for medical assistance are not subject to pet fees under the ADA. This documentation isn't optional, it's legal protection." Ryan didn't even look up from the screen. "I already told you, sir. The policy's clear. You want to stay with the dog, you pay the fee. Otherwise, we have to ask you to leave." Frank's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the folder. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I served in 3 theaters. That dog's the reason I can sleep in a room with a closed door and not wake up ready to fight shadows. I'm not asking for favors. I'm asking you to follow federal law." Ryan leaned back in his chair and let out a breathless laugh. "Look, I've seen a lot of folks come in here with these stories. Everyone's got a vest and a piece of paper. I'm not saying you're lying, just saying you don't look disabled enough to need a dog like that." The words hit like shrapnel, and for a long moment silence wrapped around the lobby, like a blanket stretched too thin. Frank didn't move, didn't flinch, but Shadow leaned forward slightly, the soft pressure of his side against Frank's leg anchoring him in place. Without a word, Frank reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He pressed record. Ryan blinked, instantly more alert. "What are you doing?" "Documenting a potential ADA violation," Frank said quietly. "I've tried to resolve this respectfully." "You can't record in here," Ryan snapped. "This is private property. I'll call security, or the police if I have to. You can call whoever you need." Frank replied, not raising his voice. "But you should know, threatening someone with law enforcement because of a documented disability, that's a violation too." A rustle near the fireplace caught Frank's attention. An older man, tall, silver-haired, wearing a long gray wool coat, had stood up from the reading chair in the corner. He looked to be in his 70s, carrying the poise of someone who'd once commanded rooms for a living. He didn't say a word, just pulled out a small phone from his pocket and quietly stepped away, dialing, as he moved toward the back of the lobby. Ryan glanced over, suddenly aware of the attention. The couple by the vending machines was still watching. The intern Toby was frozen in place, eyes darting between the screen, the dog, and the guests. "You think recording me's going to change anything?" Ryan muttered. "We deal with these kinds of things all the time." Frank looked directly at him now. No anger, no fear, just quiet conviction. "I'm not here to change your mind," he said. "I'm here so the next veteran with invisible scars doesn't have to explain himself to someone who thinks he knows better." Ryan stared but said nothing. And somewhere near the back of the lobby, the retired judge's quiet voice was already speaking into a phone, calm, measured, and very clear. Frank didn't know who he was calling, but he had a feeling things were about to shift. The lobby hung in a kind of strained silence, punctuated only by the soft hum of the vending machine and the ticking of the antique clock behind the front desk. Frank remained still, Shadow seated quietly at his heel, while Ryan shifted uneasily in his chair, fingers tapping nervously on the desk. Then it happened. The phone on the front desk rang, a loud, shrill ring sharper than the background murmur, sudden enough to make Ryan jump slightly. He glanced at Frank, then at the other guest still lingering nearby. His hand hovered over the receiver for a second too long, and when he finally picked it up, he forced a calm, customer service smile back onto his face. Red Elk Lodge, this is Ryan. How can I help you? The smile didn't last long. Frank couldn't hear what was being said on the other end, but he saw it in Ryan's face. The smug confidence drained almost instantly. His eyes widened, then darted toward the computer screen, then to Frank. His throat moved in a slow, deliberate swallow. Yes. Yes, he's still here, Ryan said, his voice suddenly hushed and uncertain. Yes, I added the fee before. I didn't realize. Another pause. Frank didn't move. Neither did Shadow. But the quiet tension in the room began to shift. Even the intern Toby had stopped pretending to reorganize the front desk brochures and was now openly watching. Yes, I saw the documentation, but I thought Ryan stammered, then stopped mid-sentence. Whoever was on the other end had begun speaking firmly, cutting through his justifications like a scalpel. Ryan's cheeks flushed. He sat up straighter, and this time his voice was a near whisper. I understand. Yes, I do. Of course. He listened again, this time longer. His gaze fell to the ADA pamphlet pinned behind the counter, one he had likely never read. It now looked like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Frank didn't gloat. He didn't even blink. He stood there, his hand resting gently on Shadow's back, watching as the wheels turned. Ryan finally set the phone down slowly, as though it might shatter in his hand. He looked at Frank, but the confident clerk from 15 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a young man realizing he had just stepped into something far larger than himself. That was corporate legal, Ryan said, his voice barely audible. Apparently someone very connected just called our regional office. They traced the incident in real time. Frank said nothing. He simply waited. They told me. I've violated federal ADA law. They're opening a live investigation. They already reviewed the service dog documentation and confirmed it's all valid. Another pause. Then Ryan looked down. They're sending a district compliance officer tonight. I'm not supposed to touch anything else. The silence returned heavier now. From behind, the judge reappeared, phone now tucked away. He gave Frank a respectful nod before quietly heading for the exit. Shadow shifted slightly, sensing the change. No tension now, no pressure, just the weight of justice slowly coming into balance. For the first time all evening, Frank allowed himself a breath that didn't feel like battle prep. The war for tonight might actually be over. Ryan stood frozen behind the desk, face pale, hands trembling slightly as he reached for the keyboard again, but this time it wasn't with smugness or control. It was compliance. Corporate hadn't just ordered him to reverse the charge. They had laid out precise instructions. No excuses, no debate, immediate correction. He clicked into Frank's guest profile, his eyes darting between screens. Sir, I'm removing the sanitation fee now, Ryan said, voice low. And I've been instructed to upgrade you to one of our signature suites. No charge. Frank watched quietly, saying nothing. Shadow sat calmly at his side, a steady sentinel. Ryan cleared his throat, then reached for a second key card. He placed it gently on the counter and slid it toward Frank, avoiding eye contact. And I owe you an apology. A pause. The couple near the vending machine stopped pretending to look at snacks. The intern Toby leaned against the back wall, now his mouth slightly open. Everyone could feel the shift in the air. Ryan struggled for words. I made a mistake. I didn't understand the law. I shouldn't have questioned your documentation or said what I said about your disability. His voice cracked just slightly. I was wrong. The old man from earlier, the one who had made the call, had returned to his seat near the fireplace. He didn't say anything, but he crossed his legs and nodded once like a judge who had heard enough. There was a moment of silence that followed. Then slowly a sound broke the tension, a quiet clap. It came from the older woman at the vending machine. Her hands came together slowly, deliberately, and without a trace of irony. A few seconds later, her husband joined her. The intern clapped, too unsure if he should, but knowing deep down it felt right. By the time Frank took the new key card, half a dozen guests were applauding, not loudly, not mockingly. Just enough to mark the moment. Just enough to show that someone had noticed. Ryan's face flushed again, but he didn't say anything more. His earlier confidence had vanished, entirely replaced by the sobering awareness of what his ignorance had nearly cost both himself and the hotel. Then the front doors opened. A woman in her early 50s entered briskly, wearing business slacks, a Lodge-branded coat, and a badge on a lanyard. "Mr. Delaney," she asked, scanning the room. "I'm Evelyn Price, regional manager. I was just briefed by legal. May I speak with you privately?" Frank gave a slow nod. Shadow rose silently to his feet beside him. Ryan stepped aside as Evelyn motioned toward the lounge. As Frank passed the desk, he didn't look back, but those watching could see it clearly. Something had shifted. Not just in policy, but in awareness. The law had spoken. So had the room. And the message was simple: dignity isn't optional, and neither is respect. The suite was more than Frank needed: king-size bed leather armchair, a stone fireplace flickering in the corner, but not more than he deserved. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment, shoulders still tense, eyes scanning out of habit. Two windows, one fire escape heavy door, with a deadbolt bathroom mirror facing the hallway. It was second nature, the mental map he made of every room he entered. Old habits didn't die. They just went quiet. Shadow stepped in first, making a slow circle around the suite, nose low to the ground, tail steady. Once satisfied, the dog returned and sat at Frank's feet, gaze locked on him. Frank gave a soft nod. "Clear, huh?" He set the worn leather folder down on the desk, peeled off his coat, and sat in the armchair beside the fireplace. The warmth felt good on his knees. He leaned back, letting the silence of the room wrap around him like a long-forgotten blanket. But peace didn't come easily. As he watched the fire flicker, faces began to return. Young faces. Some too young. Men he'd bunked with, fought beside, buried. Williams, who used to whistle Sinatra songs, on the flight deck in '83. Ramirez, who laughed even as the jungle closed in around them in Panama. Bellamy, who always had a spare magazine and a terrible joke ready in Iraq until the convoy hit that pressure plate. Frank hadn't seen them in years, but they came often in moments like these. Quiet, flickering memories that lived in the glow of firelight and the shadows of night. He closed his eyes just for a second. He remembered Bellamy asking him once, half serious, "You think they'll remember us back home?" Frank hadn't answered then. He still wasn't sure how. His chest tightened for a beat, a low wave of grief more familiar than he'd admit. Then, like clockwork, there was a quiet sound, a soft rustle against the bedspread. Shadow had climbed onto the floor beside the armchair, curled in tightly, head resting near Frank's boots. His deep brown eyes watched the fire, not alert, not tense, just there, present. Frank reached down, running his hand along the dog's back. Steady, smooth reel. That was the thing. The metals were packed away. The scars, emotional and otherwise, were hidden beneath layers. But Shadow didn't need proof, didn't need explanations. He just stayed. For the first time in hours, Frank felt something loosen inside. Not joy, not relief, just rest. And on this long, bitter night in Montana, that was enough. 3 weeks after Frank returned to his quiet home in rural Oregon, a package arrived on his porch. No return address, no promotional stickers. Just his name, Frank Delaney, neatly printed on a white shipping label. Inside, wrapped in simple brown paper, was a carefully folded American flag that had once flown over the company's regional headquarters. Beneath it, a polished wooden plaque read, "In recognition of your service, sacrifice, and the quiet dignity with which you reminded us what respect truly means. Red Elk Hospitality Group." Tucked beneath the plaque was a letter on thick, embossed stationery. The words were formal but not cold, apologetic but not canned. "Mr. Delaney, We are deeply sorry for the experience you encountered at our Missoula property. You should never have been placed in a position to defend your right to dignity and access. We've initiated mandatory AD training across all our properties and updated internal policies to ensure this never happens again. Thank you for your patience and for reminding us that honoring service begins with listening. With respect, Evelyn Price, Regional Manager, Red Elk Lodge. Frank read the letter slowly once in full, and then again lingering at the words, reminding us. He didn't need a flag or a plaque. He didn't expect anything beyond silence. But something about the gesture felt right. Not grand, just right. He set the box aside and gave Shadow a pat on the head. Months passed. The snow melted. Spring crept back across the valley. Then one morning in early May, a second letter arrived, handwritten, no letterhead. The penmanship was slightly uneven. Inside was just one folded page. Mr. Delaney. This may not mean much coming from me, but I wanted to thank you. I've spent the last few months in training programs about disability rights, PTSD, and veteran care. I used to think I understood enough just by being polite. I didn't. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't humiliate me, but you held your ground. That taught me more than any textbook ever could. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just hoping to become someone who never makes another veteran feel small again. Respectfully, Ryan Mitchell Frank held the letter in his hands a long time. Then he folded it neatly, tucked it into the back of his leather folder, the one with his service dog documents, and filed it right behind his VA paperwork. Not because he needed proof, because it mattered, and because some lessons deserve to be remembered. Frank didn't tell many people about what happened at the hotel in Montana. Not because he wanted to forget it, but because he knew deep down that versions of that moment were playing out in lobbies, airports, and checkout counters across the country every single day. What he experienced wasn't just a customer service failure. It was a reflection of something bigger, our struggle as a society to understand what we can't see. There's a reason they call it an invisible disability. No wheelchair, no bandages, no obvious scars. People look at someone like Frank, upright, composed, and quiet, and assume he's fine. But trauma doesn't always leave visible marks, and healing doesn't always look like limping. We've been conditioned to think disability fits a certain mold. If you can't see it, it must not be real. But the truth is, millions of Americans, especially veterans, wake up every day fighting battles no one else can see. Anxiety, flashbacks, hypervigilance, panic, depression. And for many of them, a trained service animal isn't a luxury. It's the only thing standing between chaos and calm. Shadow isn't a pet. He's a lifeline. And every time someone rolls their eyes at that vest or questions the paperwork, it sends a message. Prove your pain or it doesn't count. But that night in the Red Elk Lodge showed something else too, something hopeful. That one moment of ignorance can be transformed into a lasting lesson. That a young man like Ryan, who said the wrong thing, could listen, learn, and grow into someone better. Not everyone gets fired. Not everyone should. Sometimes the right kind of change starts with education, not punishment. For older viewers, those who've lived through decades of shifting attitudes toward veterans and disabilities, Frank's story might feel both familiar and painful. You've probably seen the same kind of dismissal, the same kind of quiet disrespect. But here's what matters. Frank stood his ground, with dignity, with patience, and with the unshakable weight of truth on his side. So if you've ever had to explain yourself to someone who wouldn't listen, if you've ever been told you don't look disabled, or if you've ever watched a fellow veteran walk out of a room in shame, they weren't alone. We hope this story reminded you of that. If it did, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Share your own experience, or simply say you understand. Because stories like Frank's aren't just touching, they're necessary. They open eyes. They remind us what respect really means. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Let's make this more than a story. Let's make it a conversation. And if you found value in this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we continue to share the quiet, powerful stories that still matter, especially to those who've given so much and asked for so little in return. Thank you for watching. We all see you in the next video.